I won't give you too many spoilers as we go through this. I will try my best not to spoil the book for those of you who haven't read it yet. But as Dean said, my name is Mark Nunnikhoven. I've been working in the cloud since the cloud was a thing, since it was even before a thing, and it was a beautiful little Visio icon. And what I wanted to do was, in contrast to Rebecca's fantastic talk, which was diving into like the technical details around the MITRE attack framework, I wanted to give you guys a little more strategic talk, something to think about when you're looking to apply something like the MITRE framework and your security practice in general. So I thought Gene's new book would be fantastic. It's a really good perspective around development, but we're going to look at it from a security practitioner's lens, because most of us here on the stream are security practitioners, or at least heavily involved and interested in it. So as Dean alluded to, this is not the first book by Gene and the crew. The first one was actually the Phoenix Project. Hopefully, and let me know here in the chat on Twitch, you guys have all heard and read this book. You've had 7 years. I'm not going to guilt you into feeling bad if you haven't, but hopefully you've read the Phoenix Project. That was followed up by the DevOps Handbook, which is a little more practical, then Accelerate, and now finally the fourth one in this set is the Unicorn Project. And it showed an evolution of how IT is changing, and just in general how things are adjusting as we move into the cloud, and how that enables some cultural change around how IT services are delivered. Now, this all sounds crazy for most security people, but bear with me. This has a direct relevance to our work and to the technical stuff that we're dealing with. And just to give you a little perspective, even though I consider myself pretty technical, I'm a digital forensic investigator by training and trade. I've spent the last few years of my research focused more on the cultural side of this, because there's a lot of impacts that affect us as security practitioners that we don't necessarily have time to kind of step back and realize. So we end up kind of scrambling and always fighting these fires and not necessarily realizing why, which is why I wanted to bring this talk to you guys. So with these books, with the Phoenix Project, it really started with this crazy idea that development and operations should work together instead of like being a blood feud between departments. They might want to actually collaborate and move things forward as a team. The DevOps Handbook really gave you some tactics and playbooks to make that work. It's a very practical book. The Accelerate addition to the lineup here really said, here's some data to help support this cultural transformation, because a lot of the work that was suggested in the DevOps Handbook wasn't contained just to IT. So it started bleeding out to the business. Accelerate helps you make that business case. And the Unicorn Project is sort of that next level. It says, based on all these changes, development needs better tooling and better support. And here's some of the reasons why and some of how that might look. So that's really the sequence. In this, the Unicorn Project really highlights a few key roadblocks, and we're going to call out 3 of them specifically. Lack of understanding what needs to be in place is a big one. So just going, hey, I deployed my code, I was able to write it. If you're like Dean's brother, I'm writing it in .NET, and then in order to do that, I need .NET locally, and that's it. But there's a whole bunch of stuff underneath there that actually needs to be in place. You need Windows servers, or you need supporting open source platform now, which is wonderful since .NET went open source and multi-platform. But you need that in place to actually deploy out. There's a bunch of stuff under there that's assumed, that you have computing resources, you have memory, you have connectivity, a whole bunch of this stuff out there that just kind of assume is there. And it's nice to be able to assume and take that for granted, but that's, there's work that needs to be done. Another key point here is making sure that data is where it needs to be most effective. I don't know if you guys have realized this in your cloud journey yet, but the number one thing that keeps you anchored in a specific cloud or prevents you from taking advantage of other cloud services is actually the location of your data. It is the biggest weight or anchor. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of. And then finally, that cultural aspect. Pro tip, people don't like change. It's just generally how it is. Organizations really struggle with change, especially fundamental change. So those are the big roadblocks. And to counter this, Gene comes up with this idea of the 5 ideals. And we're going to frame the talk today around these 5 ideals. And we're going to see how development wants to take these ideals forward, how you as a security practitioner can help them, and also how you can steal these ideas to make your work better. And I think that's really the key. And of course, seeing these on screen, none of these are groundbreaking. None of these are or, revelatory, like, oh, I never thought about being, focusing on my customers before. It's all pretty straightforward stuff. But the beauty of the way these books are written, so the Unicorn Project and the Phoenix Project take the same approach. They're actually novels, is that they help you walk through it in a very understandable way. They're not academic dissertations. They're just straight up novels where you follow the character. And in our case, our main character is Maxine. Maxine's a kick-butt engineer, but right out of the gate, and this is not a huge spoiler, this happens in the first chapter, there's a massive outage at her company. She ends up getting hit with the blame for it, even though she has really nothing to do with it. She saved the company's bacon, but they blame her and they kind of exile her off into this new project. And she ends up starting this new journey. And of course, she's pulling her hair out because some of the stuff she faces is just mind-blowing. It's baffling. But as you read the book, you sit there going, no, I've seen that. I understand that. That's totally something that I've said to somebody, which, is a terrifying thing to reveal. But then as she progresses through the entire system or the entire novel, what you'll see is her experiences frame the cultural changes and the technical changes within the organization. So Maxine's definitely the hero of the story. We're going to also add for this talk, William. William doesn't exist in the book. The reason being, the people in the book that represent security are not exactly what you would consider inspirational. I think they're terrifyingly accurate, but they are not where we actually want to be. So I made up this guy. William is going to be our stand-in for a good security team, a modern security team, a security practitioner like you who are tuned into this meetup and taking this in. So William's going to be our new hero to complement Maxine, who is the heroine for the book. So that being said, the first ideal in Gene's book is locality, and simplicity, okay? That's a weird kind of thing. Simplicity, I think everybody understands. We want things to be simple as possible. All this stuff is complicated enough. So we want to strive for simplicity, but locality is a really, really interesting aspect. So let's dive into that. What it means from the development perspective. So remember, Maxine, she's our DevOps engineer. We are going to, and I hate that I even just said DevOps engineer. I've adapted too much to the marketing that's out there. Well, the proper terminology there, especially for those of you who read the book, she's an engineer who practices a DevOps philosophy, right? Short term to DevOps engineer, but you know what I'm getting at. Please don't hold that against me. Let me know in the chat if you're holding it against me. So with Maxine, let's say she's got something really, really simple. She just wants to deploy, right? And whether this is her first deploy or her 1,000th deploy, and those could be in the same week if she's really crushing it. She has the same challenges. She needs access to the code, and there's stakeholders for the code. She needs access to systems, period. Just general access and permissions. There's stakeholders there that she needs to check with. She needs licenses for some of this stuff. She needs resources, and she needs customers, right? So all of these things that happen, she needs to be involved with. And essentially what she ends up doing is going through this little rigmarole of jumping through hoop after hoop after hoop after hoop in order to actually get something out to their customers. In the book, it is I was feeling uncomfortable reading how she had to get to the point to deploy a very, very simple thing into production. It drove me crazy. That's one thing I know with the teams that I work with. We work really hard on making sure that especially a new engineer on the team or a new developer can deploy something to production in the first day. Very first day, because there's a huge amount of accomplishment there. There's a great feeling to be able to launch something right out of the gate. So that's huge. This is the traditional sort of environment that Maxine has to deal with, though, just hoop after hoop after hoop, preventing her from actually doing her job. So what's ideal is if a lot of those same things were contained and under Maxine and her team's authority, if they had the autonomy to choose their tooling, to figure out their workflow, but everything was set up for self-service, and she has that sort of within her own bubble. So they have access, they have the code, they have the licensing, they have the resources they need, and they can deploy that directly with customers. So you can see we got rid of a huge amount of steps here just by moving some of the boxes around. Now, this is local. This is simple. So local, it's within, you can think of sort of mentally arm's reach. for the team instead of them having to go out and find a whole bunch of different stuff, right? That's that concept of keeping it local. And we've also simplified this significantly. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, it's nice to live in a world without stakeholders. Stakeholders still exist here, but the difference is how they're involved. Instead of them being gatekeepers, instead of them having to approve every little thing, you get a high level sort of mission from them. So go accomplish this, go get this done, and then grant the team enough authority and autonomy to actually go out and accomplish that goal. So very much that trust in your professionals. Make sure you've got a small squad that has all the tools they need. That's the ideal, okay? Now, from a security perspective, let's go back to William, our new hero, our new go-to persona. And if you want to help development, if you want to get development moving forward towards their ideal, you need to get away from what you see here on screen right now, which is I have to approve this, I have to verify it, I have to conduct an audit. I am a roadblock, and security is traditionally set up as a roadblock. We stop things from happening. Guess what? We're really good at stopping things from happening, all right? That is to our detriment. That is to our security posture's detriment. But because of the amount of stuff that is coming our way really, really quickly, we tend to kind of default back to the like, nope, you're not going to get it done. I need to verify. I need to go through this stuff. This runs directly counter to what Maxine and the team want. So we need to shift away from this mentality. This is a bad thing. We need to get away from the gate. Now, I'm not saying abandon your security principles. I guarantee I'm not seeing it in the chat, but I'm pretty sure there's at least a few of you who are freaking out right now when I'm saying you don't need to be in approving and verifying at every stage. Let me know if you are. This is very, very much open to discussion. Happy to take questions as we roll, as well as at the end. But the idea here is stay to your security principles, but we need to implement them in a completely different way. So here we need to switch to educating, right? So we need to enable our engineers to understand why we're doing things. So we listened to Rebecca's talk around MITRE, and one of the mentions in the questions was around Stride. Stride's really intensive, lots of work to get that kind of modeling done. So it only gets done once in a while. But there's not a lot in Stride that teaches you why. Right? Why are you doing these things? And that's one of the biggest blind spots for security, is that we're not very good at explaining why somebody would want to do something, because we're not good at communicating the risk decision. We can tell you the impact of an event, which is one part of a risk decision. We are very bad at telling you the possibility of it happening or the likelihood. So that is a really big problem. Speaking of problems, I just saw in the corner of my eye in the chat that Stephen actually admitted to something, which he probably should have admitted to publicly. So in the chats, you can comment on that in a nice, polite way. But wow, I don't feel so bad about my gaffe about calling Maxine a DevOps engineer, given that Steve just admitted to helping name that DevOps engineer certification. So great cert, by the way, but yikes. So we need to get to this concept where we're educating, right? We are helping people understand, why they want to encrypt things, as opposed to just saying encrypt everything. Especially at rest, and they go, oh, now I have to deal with keys, now I have to deal with all this stuff. Explain why it's a benefit, and especially when you do it earlier. And same, we need to shift away from being a gatekeeper to providing APIs or self-service capabilities. So for things like container scanning or vulnerability scanning, or a great example from Rebecca with guard duty in the AWS environment. And there's similar equivalents in Azure and GCP as well, but allowing development teams to not only run those tools, but also to consume that information in a way that makes sense to them. That is absolutely the way to go. Joe Bart John, absolutely 100%. Automation is the key. And that's where we're going with a lot of this. It is going to be a huge win for you to automate. So that's how we can help development. We can stop being in their way and educate them and be more self-service or provide self-service tooling for them. But we can also use this principle to help ourselves. And this is really, really key as well. Centralizing logging access and analysis. Now you notice I didn't say centralize your logs, because if you're running at any number of scales, centralizing your logs is a nightmare. You're going to take one problem, which is trying to figure out what's going on, and make it into two problems, which is trying to manage all of the data points that you are now ingesting centrally and trying to figure out what's going on. Not a good look. The best way to do this is basically leave the data in place and centralize access so that you can run things like Athena queries, run things like, look at Sentinel across in the Azure cloud or the security command center, or now it's just operations center in GCP. And that's the idea, is you have the data rests where it's close because you want to keep locality for the teams that need that data. But you as a security person need to be able to still access it and analyze it. So we need one central place that gives us access to the data that's out there, right? So in AWS world, you're doing a lot of cross-account roles. You're lining up with that sort of master member data model of the data is regionalized, but you're still accessing it centrally. It works quite well in the cloud. It also avoids that big problem of moving all that data around. Same with audit access. You want to centralize your audit access mainly by setting up these permissions and roles ahead of time. So if you are setting up a standard account in whatever cloud you have, having your security audit permissions already in place is key. Same with the permissions to access those logs. Have that in the right out of the gate. You don't have to go back and argue or negotiate for it. It's just part of the way it is. And it's a really low touch way to help people out. And then finally, you want to get out of this blockage mode, and you want to get into this idea of setting up guardrails for other teams. So there are some things that are really, really bad. Rebecca mentioned the number one thing, which is using the root account when it comes to an AWS specific example. That's a very, very bad thing. You as a security professional want to take steps to prevent that from ever happening. However, over permissioning, so granting a role or a user too many permissions, is something that happens all the time. So do you want to stop people from granting permissions? No, you want to set up guardrails like Access Analyzer in AWS to make sure that they're granting the appropriate permissions. Give you a quick tip specific to the AWS side, but again, equivalents in Azure and GCP. If you ever see, and this is a huge pet peeve of mine, let me know in the chat if it's a pet peeve of yours. In AWS, in the IAM service, in the Identity Access Management service, there is a bunch of managed policies that end in the two worst words in security: full access. So S3, Amazon S3 full access, DynamoDB full access. They grant full access to that service. You should never see them in production. You should never encounter a scenario where somebody or a service needs full access to another service. It just doesn't happen. You can always restrict the permissions down lower. But again, you want to set up guardrails to remind people of like, hey, you might want to review that. Whereas the root account is something you want to prevent. You want to choose those. Think like you have a certain number of tickets you can use on hard no's. Root account's a hard no. Over permissioning is very much a guardrail. So that's how you can use this idea of locality, of simplicity, to help yourself, right? Because we don't have enough security professionals to get the work done. So enabling other teams to do it simplifies our work, right? We localize the security work with the other team, win for them. We simplify our work, win for us, win-win, love it. All right. Second principle, second ideal here is focus, flow, and joy. If you've met Gene, joy makes sense in this case. I think a lot of us don't necessarily think of getting joy from our work, but in the context of the book, it works. The idea is essentially to be able to drill down on what really matters for the business and to solve some really interesting problems for you as a developer or you as a security person, right? So even if the word joy kind of tweaks something for you, don't sweat it. The concept makes perfect sense. So let's go back to Maxine. Let's see what our hero is up to. Well, when it comes to focus, flow, and joy, it's about using tools that make solving the problems easier. You may be thinking, wait a minute, isn't that what all these tools are for? The reality is no. The vast majority of the time, people are using tools because it's the standard, because it's what their organization dictates. In the new model, in developer enablement and development enablement, the idea is that if there's a better tool to solve the job, do it. It doesn't need to be rolled out as a corporate standard. It doesn't need to be rolled out across even any more than your team. Now, you need to worry about tool sprawl, but the idea is using a good tool for the job, right? And the funny thing is when you look at like physical labor, if you went to a carpenter and said, you can only use this saw and this hammer and this nail, they'd think you're crazy, right? There's no way that's going to get that they're going to work under those conditions. Yet in IT, we do this all the time. So using tools that make solving the problem easier is a key one. Same with focus on solving the business problem. There's a ton of work that gets done just to keep the lights on. And that's the kind of thing you need to push away. I remember I was in the UK a couple of years ago talking to all of the police services around the nation around this problem exactly. And somebody told me there that they were using about 73% of their existing budget just to maintain existing deployments, not to push anything forward. And I'm sure that's only gotten worse, and it's not unique to that organization. That's sort of general for public service out there. Is a huge amount of effort goes into maintaining what is, which is not actually directly solving the business problem, right? You need to maintain all the Exchange servers and your Active Directory and all this other stuff that may be better served as getting a managed service out of the cloud. Let somebody else worry about it. Let AWS, GCP, Azure, they're great at that stuff. They're better than you're ever going to be. Let them worry about it. And that's a huge security win too. And then finally, leveraging these platforms for feedback. And that's a huge key of developer enablement is rapid feedback so that you can adjust course. Little tiny changes enable better feedback. Good news is from a security perspective, little tiny changes means lower risk. I would much rather work with a team that's deploying 50 times a day than one that does once a week or once a month. Because if something goes wrong in 50 times a day in one of those deployments, the amount of things that changed was absolutely minuscule. So you can very quickly identify the issue and resolve it and deploy again and fix it, as opposed to trying to backtrack through a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks worth of changes. So that's what Maxine's there. Now, if we put our William hats back on and go, how can we help development get there? This is a standard DevOps sort of workflow. You've got development on the left-hand side of the left-hand side of the screen. I always get the reverses back. Left-hand side of the screen, you've got the development flow, so they're coding things. Right-hand side, you've got the operational flow, so things are running. Security traditionally only ever works over here in operations. We need to push towards the other side, pushing left and help enable it. So how do we do that? Back to our two core principles, really, is that in the production side, we want to make sure that it's an immutable platform so that things aren't changing. Operations development, believe it or not, and security, we love stability. Immutability equals stability. Remember that, internalize that. It's an absolutely huge win for us if we can have immutability out in the environment, in the production environment. And then on the flip side, on the left-hand side for development, what we want to do is provide that self-service for security. So here's where we have our like image scanning, file scanning, vulnerability scans, testing results, things like that, but in a self-service way. So very cloud mentality, very much APIs first and APIs only. The vast majority of the time, because we need to slot into that workflow. We don't want to do anything to slow them down. We're trying to enable them to do security at speed. Now, this principle works for us as well. So let's get greedy. Let's see how we can improve our security lives. Well, we can automate everything. In the cloud, everything is accessible through an API, or at least 98% of it is. So anything that you're doing should be fully automated. You should have a code repository in your security team that has all of your operational playbooks as scripts. I don't care if it's a series of bash commands, just make it automated. And in fact, believe it or not, this is going to make some people cringe. It made me cringe when I saw it, but then I stepped back and went, hey, this made sense. I have seen teams who have taken bash scripts and deployed them into Lambda. So running a serverless function that is running just bash scripts. Why? Because it worked. It was bad, it was clunky, but it worked. So they were going to fix it later, and they will get to it eventually, but at least it worked, because under the covers, Lambda is just running in an Amazon Linux 2 container. It has a whole bunch of tools that you can install to augment what's already there. So bash actually ran just fine. Ugly? Sure, but it worked, and that was the huge key. So automate absolutely everything. Then go back and automate all those things that you thought were special and you couldn't automate because they were just too hard. Yeah, those two. And then the ones that are actually impossible too. Because you know what? If you're not automating, you are going to continue to drown in drudge work. So we were talking around Rebecca's talk in the Q&A there about pushing things out to SIM. I don't know how many of you are frontline analysts in SOC. Let me know in the chat. Steve and Dean are grabbing the questions, and I see some of them, so I'll answer them as we go. But if you've ever sat in a SOC as a frontline analyst, it's boring. super boring because you're just chewing through a whole bunch of meaningless events and alerts. And then finally finding gold maybe once a shift, right? That's stuff that we can get rid of. If you automate everything to the core, you can get rid of most of that. I was never more blown away than Steve Schmidt, the CISO at AWS, was on stage 2 years ago at reInvent, who came in and said, hey, by the way, we only have one security engineer on call at any given time in AWS for everything. And that's mainly because they've applied a lot of these principles and they've automated absolutely everything. So third principle, third ideal, improvement of daily work. Pause, hold on. Security is horrible at this. We are absolutely generally crap at improving our daily work. And I say this having talked to security teams and worked with security organizations around the world. It is just as close to a universal truth as we have. We are bad at improving our daily work, mainly because we are putting out fires constantly. And because we are constantly putting out fires, we actually create more and more technical debt for ourselves, more security debt, and we make the problem even worse. So keep that in mind. Let's go back to Maxine. Let's talk to Maxine and then see what this means for development. Well, there's two main concepts here. One is the innovation flywheel, where a development team would have an idea. They're going to run a little experiment, and then they're going to get some feedback from that experiment. Okay, very simple. They're just going to run this constantly, right? Go round and round and round, idea, experiment, get some feedback, and improve, right? So really fast iterations, really small adjustments to design a better outcome. And then the second thing is a very popular concept from Toyota's manufacturing. It's been adopted into the DevOps philosophy, the and chord. And this is essentially anybody can stop the build at any time if there's any sort of problem. Now, the idea behind this when people start to adopt is like, ooh, wait a minute, I don't want to cause a big problem for a local problem. I don't want to cause a global issue. Well, the idea is actually you should pull this as often as required. So not once in a blue moon, but constantly. Because the idea is as soon as you stop that work, so you hit the chord to stop a deployment or to stop a build, and then you fix the issue and people jump in to help you to fix the issue. The and chord is really just a fancy way for catching technical debt as it occurs. So instead of letting it queue up and going, yeah, that's fine, we can deal with it later. Later never comes. Let's be honest. Later never comes. The and chord is really all about diving in and stopping those problems and fixing them right when they happen. So that's the development view. From our William hat, if we want to help development enable this, well, again, it comes back to educating them as to why we're applying specific security principles. Why is it bad to have full access to every service for a developer's username? Why, or user account or role? Why is it bad that they're just transferring data in the clear and not encrypting it? Why is, why are these things bad choices versus the possible better choices, right? And maybe sometimes that is a good choice, but it's really all about making sure they have the information and the education and the background to make an intelligent choice for their situation. And again, it comes back to self-service. I love when I can reuse a slide because it means we're on the key point. You need to educate, you need to provide self-service API tooling to your internal customers, which is development primarily and other IT teams. So let's steal this idea for us though, right? So how can we help ourselves here? Well, the concept of the and chord is absolutely critical, and it's one I firmly believe security teams should be using. So the idea is when you're doing something and there is a problem, you stop the work and get help and resolve it in the moment. You don't let it linger. You don't let it figure out, okay, I'll add it in the to-do list and I'll go loop it back in later. You address it immediately. And the primary reason there is to not accumulate technical debt, because technical debt is security debt. Okay, you don't want to have a whole bunch of tiny issues that you're going to end up with a death by 1,000 cuts. You want to be able to stop this right away. Now, it's tricky to get into this, but it's really a great way to start automating more things. Every single time you see a blip or a hiccup or a problem with any type of workflow you're doing, you put another automation in place, right? You add to that code repo, that's your playbook. We're going to have a whole bunch of either Azure functions or cloud functions or Lambda functions that are running this playbook based on incoming triggers from your cloud infrastructure. But if you take the time to fix the problems as they pop up with this concept of pulling the and chord, you are going to be in a much better place as opposed to looking back 5 years when you're in a traditional environment and you're looking at your server estate and going, yeah, we've got a whole bunch of workarounds, all these special cases. None of them are really special, right? They end up being a series of decisions that made sense in the moment that no longer make sense, and they're weighing you down, preventing you from moving forward. So adopting this concept will move your security move it forward in a very effective manner. Gilly Willie made a fantastic comment. Security is very much a shared responsibility. All three cloud providers position that model as how they work with users, but it also goes down into the sort of microcosm of how you as a security team work with your internal teams as well, understanding where the responsibility lies. But your primary responsibility as a security team is educating the other teams so that they can start doing the work and fulfill their part of the shared responsibility model. So we're coming into the tail end here. Fourth one is a weird one, but it's super important. Psychological safety. I'm not a shrink. I've seen many shrinks, but I'm not a shrink. What psychological safety means in the concept of development is really about building a culture that supports making mistakes. People make mistakes all the time. It's building a culture that makes that okay so that people don't try to hide them, that they accept responsibility for them so that you can resolve them. That there's no fear that if they did make a mistake that they're going to lose their job or be punished. And this one, the book, The Unicorn Project, kicks off with not even a mistake, but a perceived reputation hit where somebody pays a huge price. It's the opposite of a psychologically safe environment. And finally, an environment where it's okay and normal to discuss problems openly and to talk about the problem, not about the person. And that's a key distinction. Instead of saying, Mark sucks, this is why, talking about last time when we deployed, he deployed the last, the previous version instead of head was deployed, which caused the following issues. Not Mark did this, but this is what happened from a factual perspective so that we can improve and be better. That's what psychological safety is all about. So from security, huge role to play here because this runs counter to what other people perceive us as. I don't honestly think we feel this, but people perceive this as, the department of no, the department who's going to stop things. So for us, not assigning blame, especially in a security incident. I will give you the number one issue that I see and deal with and talk about all the time. It is specific to AWS, so Dean's going to be chuckling, but it could happen in Azure, just not that visible. Buckets. Amazon S3 buckets being exposed. The amount of people blame that I see in media articles, on social media for people exposing S3 buckets. Should they be exposed? No. They start life completely locked down to the entity that created them. So somebody has taken an action at some point to open them up, which means it was a mistake most of the time. All these big breaches that you've seen, they were all mistakes. Same with Redis and Elasticache and Elasticsearch. There's a recent one this week, 10.8 million records from an adult film company or adult streaming company were leaked because I think it was a Redis server that was exposed. It was improperly configured. But if you're looking and you're in the security response team, if you're assigning blame, it's just going to be a huge problem, right? So don't assign blame because you want to support this culture of learning, of teaching, of educating. And if you're constantly blaming people, if you're ridiculing them for making mistakes or there's a fear of reprisal, you're not going to learn. You're not going to have that environment where they're getting better. So you're just going to see more and more. You're going to burn people out. You're going to lose the best people. And you're going to end up, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then finally, for security, you want to trust and enable. Right? You actually want them to do things. Yes, you want to verify, fine, that's fine. But stopping people to do it because you can't trust them, that's a problem. That is a huge problem, and that needs to be tackled and addressed. If you can't trust an employee, you've either got a trust problem yourself, right? You need to let go and enable and educate that person, or you've hired the wrong person. It is not a scenario where professionals should be preventing other professionals from doing work because of a lack of trust, right? There's a core issue that needs to be addressed there. All right. So this helps us on our own, where we can foster a culture within security where it is okay to make a mistake, where there's no fear of reprisal, and it's okay to discuss problems. Again, reusing the same thing as development because we should have a psychologically safe environment as well. Just seeing here, Go With The Flow has a comment on learning more about security practices in your daily work. Absolutely, huge problem for developers. Where do they go to find this stuff, right? Where do they go to learn this? And first step for me, in my opinion, should be your security team. If your security team has fostered this sort of culture, they should be able to say, hey, great, here's a ton of good information. Are we there yet? No. So I'll pop some links up after that'll help you get started on that journey to learn security in the context of the cloud. This meetup is a fantastic start. And it's, meetups like this, great talks on YouTube, a lot of blog content out there, but I'll fire some links off. But hopefully we can all get to a point where that first stop should be your security team. So the fifth ideal, the final ideal, as we're in the tail end of this, is customer focus. This one's pretty straightforward. You should be doing everything you can as a developer to focus on the customer and on the core of the business, not context. So if your business is selling widgets or making a service that lets people share cat photos, anything you can do to make that experience better is what you should be focusing on, not on back-end plumbing. Back-end plumbing should be delegated to your CSP 100% of the time. Asking this key question, does this matter, right? Does this matter to my customer? That's the guiding light for development, and then getting rid of everything that doesn't line up with that. And that's the biggest, hardest step here. Now from security, this is how to help development, how to help ourselves. It's the same thing. You need to do the exact same thing. You need to focus on the core of the business, not context. All these big infrastructure projects, they're gone. This is not the kind of work we need to be doing now. We need to be focusing on the customer. We need to be moving things forward there. And the way we do that is by delegating out to either other teams that we've enabled, or more importantly, removing that work because our CSP now does it. So if you have to pick between like a managed database or rolling your own, pick the managed one every single time. Right? Rebecca used serverless as an example. If your team is building a new application, you start with serverless. If you can't meet your needs there, which is unlikely but possible, you go to containers, managed containers. If you can't do it with managed containers, do it with self-managed containers. If you can't do it there, finally go to virtual machines. That's your step of last resort, because it involves a whole bunch of work, patching, configuring, hardening, all that kind of stuff that you don't want to do. You just don't want to do it anymore because it isn't your job. Your job is customer focused. So let me wrap this up, and then we'll dive right into Q&A, because I think we still have a couple, maybe a few seconds or so before we dive into an awesome quiz, which I know you're all sticking around for. 5 ideals: locality, simplicity, focus, flow, and joy, improvement of daily work, psychological safety, customer focus. These apply just as equally to us in security as they do to development. They're wonderful things. They're what we should all be working for, and we should help development get there, and we should also strive to do it with our own team. This means your security practice is now going to focus on educating development. Right? A huge, huge focus on your day should be helping others learn, because that's going to pay off in spades. It's an exponential multiplier for you in security, because you're getting someone else to do the work. The work is better done closer to their job, and it's less that you have to do. That's a huge win. Providing those self-service or API-driven security tools, and relentlessly automating your work in order to improve what you have to do in a day. That's absolutely key. Thank you very much. I think we're going to dive into Q&A now. I know there's a few popping up here in the last little bit, which is great. So while we're rejigging streams and stuff, I'll dive right into one, if that's okay with the lads. That's okay, Steve? Yeah.
Go ahead. Right, yeah. Well, I'm just getting my screen ready because I'm producer as well here, so I'm.
Oh, perfect. Bringing
the comments up. I've realized I've got the wrong background here. We'll get there in the end. There we go.
Okay. So do you want to fire up a question then, since you're in producer mode?
Yeah, sure. I guess firstly, I need to settle the sting around the DevOps engineer certification.
Yeah, that was. I almost stopped talking completely.
When I say I was partly involved in that, I was part of the team that wrote the questions for the original version of that exam. Wrote about 15 questions or so, and then the second iteration as well of that exam. And there was a very lengthy discussion on DevOps engineer as a title, and whether that was a good choice or not. Now, I can't remember. This was like 2014, so I can't remember if that was me that put that forward, but I was definitely part of those discussions. So apologies for that. But I'll put the feedback into the team. We should maybe call it the engineer with a DevOps philosophy certification or something.
Sure. I mean, the challenge we get, and it actually ties to Gilly Willy's little DevSecOps comment, is that as much as it can be frustrating, the labels can also be really useful too, right? Because if you go with now when we talk DevOps engineer, people understand what we're getting at, right? The challenge is marketing keeps going like, here's a DevOps tool, and you're like, oh, that's not what it's about. But most of us as practitioners, it's a shorthand to get through a whole bunch of stuff. And I wanted to be like, all I'm hearing is you accepting blame, but we're practicing blameless postmortems. We're in a psychologically safe environment. So it's, we're just learn and move forward, right?
Yeah. And I love that theme of the talk around just learn, educate. continues to think. So I'll bring up the first question here. This was from Elad12. It came up a while on there, a bit of a lengthy one, so I don't think you picked up as you were going through. But the question basically saying that approach of don't versus do in a large, heavily regulated enterprise, how is that different to a smaller organization, and how can you push that education in those large organizations?
Yeah, I think it's actually even more critical for large organizations, especially heavily regulated ones, to move to this type of a model. The challenge being, so I worked with the regulators for a number of years to get them up to speed on cloud stuff. And what I find good, like a positive example, especially here in Canada, is some of our financial institutions, which are very heavily regulated, are some of the most advanced in the cloud. They are taking advantage of serverless architectures. They have small distributed teams who are fully responsible for their own services. But again, they got there because they educated them around what compliance and what the regulations meant. And one of the keys to regulation, or at least compliance in the cloud, is setting things up ahead of time. Most traditional environments, when it comes to compliance, you get an audit and they basically freak out on Friday because the auditor is coming on Monday. Right. And it's like, holy crap, we need to get a mountain of documentation ready to go to get through this audit. Whereas if you set things up in the cloud ahead of time, so I'll use just a purely AWS example because it's just on the top of my head. You make sure that CloudTrail is enabled for every single region. You've got AWS config, checking some specific application settings. And what you're doing during that time is that constantly in the background, you're creating your audit trail. It's fully automated. You can pull up at any time, Tuesday at 12 p.m., what did our environment look like? And that's already there. So a lot of the hard work is done. But again, that comes down to preparation and education. And that then still enables this small model, but it makes it easier to respond because you've compartmentalized the audit. Instead of coming in and saying, we've got this ridiculous behemoth that looks like a ball of spaghetti, you go, this is Maxine's team, this is what they're responsible for, this is this service, here's all the audit evidence and compliance stuff around it. So it changes it a bit for sure, but I think it's actually more important to focus on.
Got it. Great. And there's a few, I don't know if there's anything you picked up on the chat that you missed at the end there, but I've got a few other questions. Was there anything you wanted to pick up, or was it the same question you were going to? Oh, there's one here around Agile and Scrum Master, right?
Yeah. And that's, it absolutely does. Scrum Master, Agile is one of those other terms that is kind of expanded to mean pretty much everything that's not a waterfall, which is fine. Scrum Master is a very specific approach to it. But yeah, this all applies. All these principles, all these ideals, I think on the development and the security side fall in as well. None of them run counter because it's really about enabling teams to get the work done and making sure that that's sort of as small a thing as possible. Specific to the security side of it, if you've watched any of Dr. Vogel's keynotes from AWS, he always talks about blast radius. From an operational perspective, that's making sure, if something blows up, it's as small as possible. From a security perspective, that's a key concept, and these smaller teams enable that.
Got it. Great. Thank you. And I've got a couple more questions if you're okay for a few more.
Absolutely.
That were kind of coming to me as I was listening to the presentation. I think one of the interesting things you spoke about is kind of it's okay to make mistakes, have this culture of learning. I was actually listening to a session from one of my colleagues this morning, Adrian Hornsby, on chaos engineering.
Yeah.
Talking about how chaos engineering isn't around creating chaos. It's around injecting failure and practicing failure and, handling those unknowns, let's call them. And we see that topic, chaos engineering, heavily related to the infrastructure and partly in the application space. It's starting to see more in the serverless space and focus on chaos engineering. But you don't hear much around kind of practicing chaos or practicing failure in security, at least in that same kind of group of people or community that I see around kind of chaos engineering. Security seems to be a miss there. Can you recommend any tools or anything you've seen around practicing chaos in the security world?
Yeah, I would say Adrian's GitHub repo that he just made public this morning is a great one. He's got some good Python tooling around that. Netflix's Chaos Monkey is the sort of the progenitor there. I can't remember the name of the author, but there's a great book under O'Reilly's imprint around chaos engineering. Again, you pointed out accurately, Steve, none of them are security specific. But this comes down to a core concept that's in the AWS well-architected framework around game days and practicing. I think security is just a core part of that. But a lot of people in security don't realize that, which is the problem. There's a gap there, because it's absolutely true. I think anybody who's been through an incident in a production environment knows that it would have gone a lot better if they'd practiced ahead of time. And just having it written out as a checklist and just having it written out as a document isn't enough. You need to actually take the time and go, okay, if this dies, if this goes down, whether that goes down because it was, just a failure, that's one thing. If it goes down because it was hacked, right, or it was breached, then that's a different operations path that you need to practice out. So it's absolutely critical. But yeah, I would start with Adrian's repo. It's a nice little Python tool. It greatly simplifies out like the Chaos Monkey stuff, because the Simian Army from Netflix has kind of expanded to this ridiculously massive tooling. And last time I checked, most of us weren't at Netflix's scale yet.
Yeah, I think they have a tool called Conformity Monkey as well, which is more around compliance and conforming with compliance, which falls into that kind of space as well. And I know Dean is not on the video here, but Dean's got a bit of experience, as well as some of the people I see on the chat who are Dean's ex-colleagues, because they worked on the London Olympics from a security operations perspective. And I know they did a lot of planning and, simulated a lot of attack vectors when they were planning for that large-scale significant event as well. So there's it definitely happens in places. I just don't see it well documented in that same kind of group and community that you see around chaos and cloud. Okay, one last question. Interesting, in Rebecca's talk, she was using serverless tools to manage a serverless application, which is kind of great. I love that. And kind of do that security automation using things like CloudWatch Events and Athena and all those serverless analytical tools that are available. You mentioned as well, you do serverless first and automate everything. Do you think that serverless and functions are really the glue here in terms of creating this DevOps or this security automation?
Yeah, 100%. So, the Olympics is an interesting example. I was involved a bit with Vancouver way back in 2010. And, before I went private sector again, I worked for the Canadian federal government for a decade in a number of security roles. And the fascinating thing about monitoring and sort of observability is that you end up having another monitoring and observability tool set to make sure that your monitoring and observability tool set is up and running. Right? Because you're relying on your monitoring tools to make sure that if production goes down, but you also need them to be up all the time as well. So serverless is a perfect fit. Pushing more and more to your cloud provider is a perfect fit, because now you're getting them to worry about that stability. Like, is it up and running? Yes, it is. Good. For serverless, the thing I love about it is it's super low cost. Right? Like, your monitoring bills drop to almost nothing, which is a key consideration. But also, as far as the portability and the scalability, it's really hard to beat that. So yeah, I would move as much as I could to a serverless approach, and as much as I could to a managed environment. So if you're in GCP, leveraging all the operations center suite stuff. If you're in Azure, it's the same thing. There's all these tooling that the cloud providers give us that isn't labeled as security tooling that is critical to our work.
Yeah, CloudWatch Events in my world in AWS, I'm doing a lot around security using CloudWatch Events or EventBridge, which is the kind of new fun name for basically the same thing. Well,
EventBridge makes it way easier to connect a lot of the stuff that we weren't connecting before, and you've got third-party SaaS products into EventBridge as well. But yeah, you can't beat that simplicity, and that's the nice thing is that we've seen from all three clouds is an increase in making this easier and easier, to the point where you can just drag and drop in some of the tools like an AppFlow, where you're like, okay, cool, I want this to talk to this, done.
Yeah, simplicity is key. Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining us all the way from Ottawa in Canada. So great to have our first international speaker in this. These uncertain times have allowed us to have your expertise on the call. So we really appreciate you jumping on this and sharing your knowledge with our audience here. And hopefully we'll maybe see you at a in-person event in London sometime in the future as well.
I hope it's sooner than all of us expect at this point. But yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on the stream today.